Every phone screen type explained. LCD. If you've ever bought a budget phone and noticed the screen looked a little flat, you've already met the LCD. The abbreviation stands for liquid crystal display. The screen got its name because behind the glass is essentially a lamp that shines through a layer of liquid crystals. Those crystals act like tiny gates, twisting open or closed to control how much light passes through, and a color filter in front gives each pixel its red, green, or blue tint. It's a technology that's been around since the 1980s and still powers everything from phones to the little screen on your washing machine. Anyhow, when it comes to LCD screens, the lamp is also a problem. The thing is, it's always on. Showing a black image doesn't mean turning the light off. It means blocking it as well as the crystals can manage. So black on an LCD screen is really dark gray, contrast is limited, and colors that should pop look a little like they're being seen through a thin fog. For a long time, this was just the trade-off you accepted. The technology was mature, predictable, and good enough. And in bright daylight, it still holds its own against most alternatives. Then OLED came along and, well, things changed. OLED. OLED solves the LCD problem pretty much like how you'd normally deal with the lamp that won't turn off. Throw it out. That's right, there is no backlight on an OLED display. Each pixel generates its own light using organic compounds that glow when electricity passes through them. When a pixel needs to show black, it switches off entirely. This is why OLED screens have a contrast ratio that LCD can't really compete with. The difference is particularly obvious in dark scenes, but OLED comes with a few vulnerabilities. The most significant is burn-in. If the same image sits on the screen for too long, the organic compounds in those pixels degrade faster than the ones around them, leaving a faint speck. Navigation bars and keyboard outlines are the usual culprits. Now, manufacturers manage this with software tricks like slightly shifting the image or dimming static elements, but none of it really solves the problem. On the upside, without a rigid backlight, OLED panels can curve, bend, and fold, which is what makes a foldable phone possible to begin with. AMOLED. Equip an OLED with a better system, and you get an AMOLED. The letters stand for Active Matrix Organic Light Emitting Diode, and the part that deserves most attention is active matrix. You see, in older display technologies, pixels were controlled in rows and columns. The system would scan across the screen, addressing each pixel in turn. It worked, but it was slow, and at high resolutions, the approach simply couldn't keep up. Active matrix means that each pixel has its own switch that can fire without waiting for the scanner to get around to it. You get faster response, better precision, and much better power efficiency. The technology was first developed by Samsung, which still manufactures a significant share. Apple, Google, and most other flagship phone makers buy their AMOLED displays from Samsung. Yes, I know it hurts, but the screen in your iPhone is probably made by the same people who made the screen in a Galaxy. 120 Hz. Hertz tell you the exact number of times per second your screen refreshes, and for the first decade of smartphones, every screen refreshed at 60 frames per second. Then OnePlus shipped a 90 Hz screen in 2019, and suddenly 60 Hz looked like a slideshow. A modern 120 Hz screen redraws itself 120 times per second, which means animations are twice as smooth as 60 Hz. In fact, the perceptual difference is large enough that most people who try it refuse to go back. The cost is battery. Refreshing 120 times per second obviously takes more power than 60. Early high refresh phones burned through batteries faster than their predecessors, which was a reasonable criticism. Modern phones solve this with adaptive refresh rates. The display slows down when you're reading something still and ramps up when you start scrolling, but the power demand is still there. Some manufacturers cap their phones at 90 Hz as a middle ground, smoother than 60 Hz, less demanding than 120 Hz. It's also never mentioned in a marketing campaign. HDR. You've probably heard about the HDR on a camera, and no, it's not the same thing as on the screen, but they do share the same three letters and the same basic ambition. The goal of both is to capture more range between the brightest and the darkest than a standard setup. On a display, HDR means the screen can show content that was mastered with extreme contrast in mind. We're talking about highlights bright enough to feel like sunlight, shadows dark enough to feel like midnight, and a full range of color in between. Standard content compresses all of that into a narrower band. HDR content doesn't, and a screen that supports it can show the difference. What makes a display HDR capable is a combination of peak brightness and contrast. Peak brightness is measured in nits. The higher the number, the more it can simulate a bright light source, like a lamp in a dark room. Contrast determines how far the display can go in the other direction. HDR also comes in competing formats, such as HDR10, Dolby Vision, HLG. Most flagship phones support 2 or 3 of these, and most people never think about what they're doing. In plain terms, these are different standards for packaging HDR content and telling the screen how to interpret it. Dolby Vision carries the most information, updating its instructions scene by scene rather than applying one set of settings to a whole film. Retina. Retina is Apple's name for a display resolution high enough that your eye, at a normal viewing distance, can no longer pick out individual pixels. The concept comes from the limits of human vision. The eye can only resolve detail up to a certain density. Pack more pixels in than that threshold allows, and the extra resolution becomes invisible. For example, you can't see the difference between a 400 pixels per inch display and a 600 pixels per inch display at arm's length. This is because your eye has already run out of the ability to distinguish them. So, what Apple did was calculate where that threshold sits for a phone held at a typical distance and build a screen that exceeded it. When the iPhone 4 launched in 2010, the effect was striking. Text looked like it had been printed, and edges on icons were actually sharp. If you held an older iPhone next to it, it suddenly looked like it was covered in a fine mesh. Apple has since applied the Retina label to MacBooks, iPads, and other products, each calibrated to the expected viewing distance for that device. The name has become a bit of an umbrella term, but the original logic still holds. Pixels dense enough that you can't spot them. LTPO. Picture a security guard who flips on every light in the building every few seconds, just in case something moved. That's a standard high refresh screen. Remember, it redraws the whole picture 120 times a second, whether you're scrolling through a feed or just staring at a text. LTPO changes that. The name, low temperature polycrystalline oxide, is the kind of thing you'd find on a chemistry exam, but ignore it. What matters is the trick it does. This type of panel can change its own refresh rate on the fly, scaling anywhere from 1 Hz up to 120 Hz depending on what's actually on screen. So scrolling fast still gets the full 120 Hz treatment. It's smooth, responsive, without compromise. But the second you stop, the screen drops down to a single refresh per second. You won't notice it happening, and the moment you touch the screen again, it snaps back to full speed instantly. LTPO panels tend to get noticeably better battery life than phones stuck running one fixed refresh rate around the clock, smooth or not. And there's even a knock-on effect. Without LTPO, the next feature on this list would be a battery disaster. With it, however, it's an even greater deal than we could have imagined. Always-on display. Most phone screens turn off when you're not using them, which is great, except for the part where you pick up your phone to check the time about 40 times a day. Nearly all of those pickups involve unlocking the screen, reading the time, and putting the phone down. So it's a 3-step process for a 1-step question. This is why always-on display keeps a small amount of information visible on screen at all times. The clock, the date, notification icons, maybe a calendar reminder. The screen shows only a handful of lit pixels against a black background, and stays that way until you actually pick up the phone with intent. The reason this doesn't destroy your battery is OLED, because each pixel lights independently. Showing a white clock on a black screen means only the clock pixels are on, everything else is off. Combined with LTPO, the power cost is small enough that most manufacturers measure it in fractions of a percent of battery per hour. It is, by almost any measure, a very efficient way to display a clock. What makes always-on display even more brilliant is how much it reduces mindless phone checking. When you don't have to unlock to see the time, you often won't unlock your phone at all, and you'll avoid a rabbit hole that usually follows the pattern. This perk was designed to give you information faster, but it accidentally turns out to give you your attention back too.